Okay, how are we doing? It's 7 o'clock on the nose. So we're going to do something a little bit different tonight for various reasons that I won't go into. But we're going to take a little side study, and I'm going to try to keep that fairly short. For those of you that saw the email or the Facebook post today, this shouldn't be a surprise. We're going to take a look at Babylon, the city. Been meaning to do this all along, but it's really important before we get into chapter 5, so I wanted to just make sure we had time to go through that. And then with whatever time we have left, I'm just going to open it up to discussion, to questions, anything about the Bible or Christianity is fair game. So if you haven't brought some questions with you, be thinking of them. Yeah, except you. You don't get to ask any questions. All right, Babylon. Babylon is the name of both a city out of the ancient world and also kind of the name of the empire. The Babylonian Empire, or Babylon itself, is sometimes used as a name for the entire empire as well. The Bible, I think we mentioned last time, you can really kind of, there's lots of ways to divide up the Bible, but we could call it the tale of two cities. One way of looking at the whole story of the Bible, almost from the very beginning, certainly all the way to the very end, is this idea that there are two different cities that run through the entire story that God has crafted together in these 66 books before us. And those two cities are, of course, Jerusalem, the city of God, and Babylon, the city of man. They are starkly contrasted with one another as we go through the Bible. And we'll see a little bit more about where it appears first in the Bible and how it's dealt with and those sorts of things as we go along. But in a nutshell, Jerusalem, despite all of its problems along the way, is really ordained from the outset by God. It is chosen and established all the way along the line. From the very first introduction, which most people don't even recognize, we're looking at Jerusalem in Genesis chapter 22 with the story of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah. At the time, it's just a barren mountain peak. There's nobody living there, or at least the Bible doesn't say that there's anybody. There may have been some nomadic tribes in the area, but when Abraham takes Isaac to the top of the mountain that God says, a specific one, in fact, it's 3 days from where Abraham lives, Abram, at the time, it's a 3-day journey, and he says, I want you to do this, and I want you to do it in a very specific spot, an exact location. Well, it turns out that location where Abraham and Isaac do the sacrifice and the substitution, and Isaac gets to go through, that's exactly the spot where Jesus is crucified 2,000 years later. So God has this entire thing planned out from beginning to end. That's the beginnings of Jerusalem. Later on, when David is looking for a place to build the temple, he buys a threshing floor that's built near that spot, not on the exact spot. Jesus was actually outside the city at the very top of the hill. Jerusalem itself and the Temple Mount is just a little ways lower where this threshing floor was, as David buys the threshing floor of Aruna. Anyways, I said I was going to do this quickly. So it's built around a threshing floor on the spot that God tells David to buy. Okay, this is not happenstance. From the beginning all the way through, this is an exact spot that God has planned. And it's focused right from Genesis chapter 22. That whole thing is one of the most powerful symbols or allegories. The proper word is a type in the entire Bible that points us directly to Jesus Christ and the crucifixion. Genesis 22 with Abraham and Isaac. So right from the very beginning, this spot on the planet Earth points us to Jesus Christ and continues to do so all the way to the very end, close to the end, the last couple of chapters of Revelation, chapter 20, I believe it is, possibly 21, where there's a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. God actually builds it himself, and it comes down out of the heavens, and there's all kinds of great fun in trying to figure out exactly what that's all about. But that's Jerusalem. So this thread runs from Genesis to Revelation. And then Babylon as well. Strangely enough, Babylon actually shows up before the first mentions of Jerusalem. And we'll come back to that. But its origin is by man, out of the line of Cain, a guy by the name of Nimrod, who was not great in terms of goodness, but great in terms of powerful ruler out of the ancient world. He was ultimately made into a god by the Babylonians, and we'll deal with that a little bit later. And I'll come to that Bible verse about that a little bit later too. Babylon from the beginning is all about man's egos, some of the same topic that we were talking about last time. It's built even in defiance or arrogance before the Lord, which is what Nimrod was all about. There's actually a mistranslation in most English Bibles about Nimrod. We'll come to that in a little bit. And it is the center, and now false religion begins ideologically all the way back in the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve try to cover themselves by their own efforts, making clothes of leaves from the garden, that's actually false religion. Okay? That's man trying to improve himself, trying to cover his own sin, self-righteousness conceptually before God, trying to hide the damage of sin by his own efforts. And God says, won't work. And God himself then institutes the sacrifice and demonstrates to them that only by the shedding of innocent blood can your sins be covered. And God clothes them. He doesn't show them how to make clothes out of skin. It says God clothed them with clothes of skin. So true and false religion start right there in the Garden of Eden. Actually with the two trees in chapter 2, but man falls into that trap in chapter 3. And then the very first thing that happened, well, I'll come back to that. All right, so in world history, this city that gets established very early on is among the oldest cities in the ancient world. Even secular history has dated it way, way, way back. 2300 BC is as far back as we can actually, as the archaeologists have actually found evidence. Biblically, we know it goes back even farther, all the way to the story of Babel, the Tower of Babel and so forth. That's Babylon. It was founded as a city 2 generations after the flood. It was Ham's, Noah's son Ham. Ham's grandson is the guy who founds Babylon. We'll come back to that. It's among the most important cities of the ancient world, and certainly among the largest. Babel, or Babylon, is known for its size, which we'll go into next, and then its strategic position on the Euphrates River. The greatest trade routes of the area and of the time pass right through the plain of Shinar, where Babylon is located. It was considered, even by secular historians, to have been the largest city and the most important city in the ancient world in 2 different times. Others kind of came and went, but Babylon rises to greatness at 2 different times. It is considered the largest city on earth. That's between 1770 BC and 1670 under King Hammurabi, who actually founded modern legal system, and then again under Nebuchadnezzar's dad, through Nebuchadnezzar until the fall of the Babylonian Empire. But ultimately, even the city stays around all the way until through Alexander's reign, all the way to 320. So from 612 to about 320 BC, it again is the largest city on earth. Some historians believe that it was the first city ever to reach and exceed the population of 200,000 people out of the ancient world. It probably went on to be much greater than that, but it was the first one to surpass that number. It's actually the capital of several succeeding world empires. The 2 big ones that we know about, in a sense 3. Babylon kind of rises to greatness twice. The Assyrians take them down for a little while, and then Babylon comes back up. So we've got the original Babylonian Empire, and then the the new Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar. That's when Daniel takes place. And then again under Alexander. Alexander actually makes it the capital of the world, the capital of the Greek Empire under him in 321 BC. All right. back to the origins. Again, secular archaeology can trace it back to at least 2300 BC. But the Bible actually first mentions the concept of cities in Genesis chapter 4 when we get the genealogy of Cain. So at the beginning of chapter 4 is when Cain kills Abel, and then the next thing and God drives him out. He becomes a nomad and so forth. But the next thing that we have are these two genealogies. First is the genealogy or the descendancy of Cain, and then the next is the descendancy of Seth into chapter 5. But we're specifically told right in 4:17, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Not the same Enoch of later on and out of Seth's line. Several of the names are very similar between Cain's line and Seth's line. But this Enoch, first thing he does is build a city. First record, first mention in the Bible, and the first record of cities being built by human beings, right there in Genesis chapter 4. Adam's grandson, Enoch, builds the first city that's recorded, and he calls it after himself. So right off the bat, we see this idea of pridefulness, associated with cities. Bible doesn't speak very well of cities. Strangely enough, even Jerusalem doesn't come off that well. Despite all of God's great intentions for it, it really requires God ultimately stepping in and setting up his own kingdom on earth and creating a new Jerusalem before it really fulfills the destiny that God had planned for it. Mankind and cities just don't do well in the Bible. But after the flood, so a couple thousand years go by, we've got the flood, takes everybody out, things start over with Noah and his 3 sons and their wives, and we have this descendancy from Noah here. Noah begets Ham. Ham is actually on the ark. After the flood, Ham begets Cush, and Cush begets Nimrod. So he's the great-grandson of Noah, and Nimrod is the one who founds Babel. So we're told in chapter 10 of Genesis, chapter 10 is referred to as the Table of Nations. Chapters 6 through 9 document the flood, and then chapter 10 describes, it's kind of strange because it's kind of reversed from chapter 11. 11 is where the Tower of Babel happens and God scatters the nations. That's chapter 11. Chapter 10 actually describes where they all went. It's what we call the Table of Nations. So it's all of the genealogies and where they ended up settling, but then chapter 11 tells the story, and it becomes more of a narrative again and proceeds directly in chapter 11 into the story of Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and so forth, the rest of the book. But chapter 10, the Table of Nations, in verses 8 through 12, we're told, Cush begot Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one on the earth. Verse 9 says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. However, many scholars believe that this is actually a mistranslation. The Hebrew is really vague. Not vague. It's difficult for us to interpret. We've lost some of the original meanings to these words. And some scholars have suggested that a better translation would be that he was a mighty hunter in defiance of the Lord. Nimrod. Okay? And certainly from the beginnings of Babel, the next thing that we see still in this same chapter is mankind banding together in the establishment of false religion and attempting to build what they call the gateway to God. Bab-el. El means God. Bab is the Chaldean word for gateway or gate. So the gate to God, it's the stairway to heaven that they're trying to build. Now, they're not literally trying to get to heaven. There's something about the worship that's going on there in the temple that's built near the top that has to do, and there's some great conspiracy theories out there about what they were trying to do with this tower and energy sources and all kinds of wild ideas, which may have some validity to them, I don't know. But for the biblical purposes, we see that they are acting in defiance of God. They're trying to attain, it's false religion. They're trying to find their own way to immortality or to the heavens with this tower that they built. And God has enough of it, and he confuses the language and scatters them, which we see the effects of to this day. despite all the nations in Europe and so forth trying to come back together again and establish a common language. And it's really, really interesting times that we live in, because we see the world trying to come back to a common monetary system, a common government system, and even a common language to overcome the effects that have gone on for some 4,500 years or more from the Tower of Babel. All right, moving forward. Description. Once again, we remember where we're at. We're here in the Fertile Crescent. Can you guys see that? I think that's as far down as I can. Sort of, kind of? Okay. This greenish area is the Fertile Crescent, and it's fertile because of these two rivers, the Tigris to the north and the Euphrates to the south. And Babylon, ancient Babylon, is positioned literally on top of the Euphrates River. The river runs through the center of it. One of the ancient historians, a guy by the name of Herodotus, who is considered the father of modern history, he was the first to really investigatively and kind of forensically become inquisitive about history and to capture it that way. Nobody had really done that. People like Homer and so forth that we have histories from, nevertheless they told them more in dramatic or narrative type form. Herodotus was the first to kind of change that. And he lived, where's my footnotes? Probably on your 484 to 425 BC, so just after Daniel himself. Between Daniel and Alexander the Great, this guy lived and wrote about Babylon, which was still in its heyday. Remember, Babylon lasted from about 600 to about 300 in round numbers. So Herodotus is in the 400s, he's right in the middle of that. He writes, "The city of Babylon did not reach the height of its glory until the reign of Nebuchadnezzar." I'm sorry, this is not Herodotus writing. This is a commentary. Nebuchadnezzar spent lavish sums of money in splendid building programs. His brilliant city included vast fortifications, famous streets, such as the Processional Way, which we'll see in a moment, canals, temples, and palaces, the Ishtar Gate, one of many, many gates around the city, through which this main street, the Processional Way, ran, which led into the city through double wall fortifications. Actually, there were three. It was decorated with rows of bulls and dragons on enameled brick. Likewise, the walls of Nebuchadnezzar's throne room were covered with enameled brick. During his days, the towering ziggurat was built. And this is different from the original Tower of Babel. This is another ziggurat which we've discovered the foundations of. Unfortunately, Alexander tore it down. Alexander intended to rebuild it because it was in disrepair. He got so far as tearing it down, but he died before he could rebuild it. Nobody did it after him. It was too big a project. So we found the foundation of it. And a ziggurat, again, is a stepped pyramid. Okay. Where was I? A towering ziggurat was built by Nebuchadnezzar. Nearby was the temple of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. Not far distant were the hanging gardens of Babylon, which is listed by the ancient Greeks as one of the seven wonders of the world. And by the way, the Ishtar Gate was actually one of the seven for a while, and later on they replaced it with the lighthouse at Alexandria, which I should remember the name of. Come to me later. Anyways, so it's the eighth wonder of the world. Got demoted by one, the Ishtar Gate. The Hanging Gardens were still on the list. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote in the 5th century BC, Babylon lay in the shape of a huge square surrounded by 60 miles of walls. That's roughly the size of 465 around Indianapolis. The greatest of which was 300 feet high and 87 feet wide, so a 30-story building. Okay, that's the height of the walls, according to Herodotus. Now, a lot of people disagree. They think that he exaggerated. We really don't know. What was found doesn't really fit any of the ancient descriptions. okay, in terms of grandeur and scope and so forth. So we really aren't quite sure what exactly we found. What we found is impressive enough. It's really impressive for most of the other cities of the ancient world, but it doesn't begin to come close to the eyewitnesses who were describing in very exact detail what they found. So we don't know. But the guy who lived at the time and the father of modern history describes it this way. 87 feet wide. They could race chariots, I think he said 6 abreast. They could turn around a 4-horse chariot on top of the walls. Within these walls, the streets of the city ran at right angles to one another. In other words, we're talking about advanced city planning. And these boulevards were lined with houses that stood 3 to 4 stories high. Its location, again, is on the Euphrates River, right in the middle of the great trade routes. The Euphrates is, in terms that we would understand, it's akin to the Mississippi, probably even bigger. Certainly longer. But big river, massive river. And the city sat astride it and actually had gates that crossed the river, which is just an engineering marvel. Nobody knows how they did that to this day. To the point that the city was impregnable and written of as such. Nobody ever successfully conquered Babylon. The only guy that ever actually invaded the city of Babylon did so by lowering the river, and we'll deal with that later, which is another engineering masterpiece. All right, size. This is artist's rendition of the ziggurat in the background. That's rather fanciful. In fact, that may actually be a depiction of the Tower of Babel. I think this is the ziggurat in the foreground. But the river Euphrates running through it. And then this is an actual plan of what's been unearthed. So we see a double wall around the square part of the city, and then this outer third wall encloses a tremendous amount of space, and the Euphrates runs essentially north and south right to the center of town. One of the main roads that comes into Babylon comes down this way, and then this long street here is called the Processional Way that passes through the double walls of the city through the Ishtar Gate here, which we'll come to with some pictures in a little bit. And then is Nebuchadnezzar's palace, and there's about 10 or a dozen different temples throughout the city and all kinds of. So Herodotus, where am I? Writing about the size, but obviously these are artists' renditions, but they're based on what has been unearthed as well as some of the ancient testimony. So the pictures that I've chosen, I thought, were probably the best way of getting a feel for what the city looked like. So Herodotus writes, the city stands on a broad plain and is an exact square, 120 stadia, which is 15 miles, in length each direction, so 60 in circumference, so that the entire circuit is 480 stadia, 60 miles. While such is its size, in magnificence there is no other city that approaches to it. It is surrounded in the first place by a broad and deep moat, full of water, behind which rises a wall 50 royal cubits, 93 feet in width, and 200 in height, 373 feet. On the top, along the edges of the wall, they constructed buildings of a single chamber facing one another, leaving between them room for a 4-horse chariot to turn around. In the circuit of the wall are 100 gates, all of brass, with brazen lintels, brass lintels, and side posts. Again, that's Herodotus writing in 480, somewhere but close to, I'm going to say 420 BC, roughly. All right. Although it's generally believed that Herodotus exaggerated the dimensions of the city, but we don't know for sure. There is one of the difficulties is that, first of all, the city, when they began to excavate it, it was dozens and dozens and dozens of feet beneath the sand to find any of it. It took a lot of work, and that work was years and years long. It started in the late 1800s, proceeded into the 1930s and so forth, and then Saddam Hussein began doing a whole lot as well that we'll come to later. But trying to figure out exactly what they're looking at and exactly what the extent of these things are involves an enormous amount of work. And oftentimes, they just tunneled rather than actually excavating all of this stuff. They would just tunnel through what they found down there in order to try to get an idea of the scope of the buildings that they were finding and so forth. But one of the other things that makes it so difficult is that other cities were built on top of certain sections. The Greeks, and then, the Persians, and then the Greeks after them, built layers of city over the city aspects of Babylon, whereas the temples and the palaces and so forth, they stood and continued to be kept in repair. But discovering where exactly the walls were and all this kind of stuff is not an easy task. So it's entirely possible that what they think they have unearthed is not what the ancient writers were talking about. All right, so I'm going to speed up a bit here. That's the ziggurat near the center of town, and then you can barely see it down here at the very left corner is the Euphrates River that flowed right by it, and the walls around that. Fortifications. Here's a little bit better view. Again, artist renditions, obviously, of the double walls and the width and the buildings that Herodotus was talking. Chambers, actually like little apartments. I don't know what they were used for. If they were only military in nature or if people actually lived in them. We know that in Jericho, which was not nearly as big, but similar in terms of the impressiveness of its fortifications, there were apartments in the walls of the city. People lived there. Rahab lived there when she entertains the spies. So in the left here, you see the beginnings of the processional way, and this blue area here, that's the Ishtar Gate. Ginormous, unimaginably complex, certainly for the time, and really it's so big that even the museum where they picked it up and moved it, they frequently did this as the archaeologists of the late 1800s just took what they want and moved it back to various places in Europe to their museums and so forth. I think it's in Berlin at the moment, and they've only been able to reconstruct just the very forepart of the gate. This little piece right here, it's not so little, it's as big as the museum could handle. So that's all of the rest of it is in storage, but only this part right here, and even that's not reconstructed to full scale. That's a picture of it in the museum. The Pergamon display, or the Pergamon Museum, something like that. I got lots and lots of references in your notes. That's why I'm going through this so quick. There's lots of other places in there if you want to study this in more detail. So again, this is the processional way, and Nebuchadnezzar, all of these bricks that everything is built from were ceramically fired in these furnaces we were talking about, but they were also glazed. They were overlaid with this beautiful blue glaze. Here's a picture, and when they dug this up, they could still see it. It was still there. It was very little damaged by time in many of the places that had been rather quickly covered. So what you see here has been cleaned, but that's the original structure that you're looking at, including all of these lions and dragons. I find it interesting. There's a whole study about the reality of the existence of dragons far into human history. That's a great fun to pursue. But Nebuchadnezzar chose lions and dragons as his two motifs for the decorations. And then there were gigantic lion statues, which I've got another one of here before too long, that lined this way. I don't see them in this. This is a model. This is a reconstruction. I don't know exactly where the lions were along the way, but they lined the processional way. All right, the Ishtar Gate was constructed by Nebuchadnezzar around 575 BC. It was the 8th gate of the city of Babylon in present-day Iraq, and was the main entrance to the city. The Ishtar Gate was part of Nebuchadnezzar's plan to beautify his empire's capital during the first half of the 6th century BC. He also restored the Temple of Marduk and built the renowned wonder, the Hanging Gardens, as part of his plan. Legend has it that one of his wives was Persian, and Babylon sits on rather a desert plain, certainly today, and I think even at the time. Despite the fact that they're in the Fertile Crescent, the local area was fairly devoid of vegetation, and she longed for her homelands, the mountains, the green mountains of her homeland. And so Nebuchadnezzar built the Hanging Gardens to make her feel at home, which is, as Herodotus describes it, is essentially a ziggurat that's plumbed and somehow, nobody knows how to this day, but Herodotus actually describes a machinery room that pumped water out of the Euphrates up into the upper echelons of the... They weren't supposed to know about pumps, according to modern technologists, historians. You know, pumps weren't invented until late in the Middle Ages or something like that. Well, the Babylonians had it figured out. They had a machinery room where they pumped the water out of the Euphrates and watered this gigantic structure covered with greenery. In fact, even the tallest trees of the time are described. I won't take you through all of that, but in Herodotus, where he describes Babylon, he spends a couple of pages out of his book, The Histories, describing the Hanging Gardens. All right. Didn't write it there either. What is the name of it? The Pharos, the lighthouse in Alexandria. Pharos, Pharos, was the name of that lighthouse. Nobody knows how they did that either. But they actually constructed a lighthouse that shined a beam of light out to sea that the mariners used to navigate by. No idea how they did this. But many, many historians write in detail about the lighthouse. And it was the one that replaced the Ishtar Gate on the list of the 7 wonders of the world. All right, the Ishtar Gate was excavated in 1902 to 1914, during which 45 feet of the original foundation of the gate was discovered. The material excavated by Robert Caldaway was used in a reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate and the processional way. In 1930, the reconstruction was finished at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, Germany. But due to size restrictions, the Ishtar Gate is neither complete nor its original size. The gate was originally a double gate, but the Pergamon Museum only utilizes the smaller frontal part. The second gate is currently in storage. Originally, the gate had a door and a roof made of cedar and bronze, which was not built for the reconstruction. A smaller reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate was built in Iraq, back in its original location, under Saddam Hussein, as the entrance to a museum there. However, this reconstruction was never finished due to war and a certain trial. All right, on the side so here's another view of the Ishtar Gate, and I don't know exactly where this is located. I think it's right here, just off to the left side, but I wouldn't swear to it. But that kind of off-colored brick that you see there, that's actually an inscription that Nebuchadnezzar had printed into the brick. And I'm not going to read the entire thing, but maybe the first paragraph. It says, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Again, it's kind of in memorandum format, like chapter 4 was. The faithful prince appointed by the will of Marduk, the highest of princely princes, beloved of Nabu, of prudent counsel, who has learned to embrace wisdom. Not that he's arrogant, right? We saw the results of that last time. Who fathomed their divine being and reveres their majesty. The untiring governor who always takes to heart the care of the cult of Esagila and Izida. These are the names of 2 of the other temples in Babylon that have been unearthed. And is constantly concerned with the well-being of Babylon and Borsippa, the wise, the humble, the caretaker of Esagila, and Izida, the firstborn of Nabopolassar, his father, the king of Babylon. Both gate entrances, and they're named, I'm not even going to try, following anyways, he goes into great detail about exactly how he built it. Okay, and all of that is inscribed right there in cuneiform. All right, on to slide 15. Some structures. There are 3 palaces within the walls, the northern, the southern, and the summer palace, which Nebuchadnezzar built for himself. somewhere that's actually got air conditioning in it, believe it or not. It uses airflow, but it actually contains a chimney that was later used in other climates. The Babylonians figured all of this out way before anybody else. By drawing air up this chimney, it actually causes a breeze through the lower parts of the structure. And that was his summer palace. The southern palace is the biggest one, and that's where he lived most of the time, and that's where chapter 5 takes place when we study that next week. There are at least 10 temples that have been discovered throughout, and you can't see them, but they're depicted in these city plans of Babylon. The processional way, there's bridges, there's at least one bridge across the Euphrates and several others. What you see here is not actually the Euphrates River, that's the moat. So in between each of these walls there is a moat, I think between and on the front side as well, which is hundreds of feet wide if I remember right, that are drawn from the Euphrates River. So it's unbelievable. All right, moving on. Sorry if you can't see these for size. I just collected some artists' renderings of the Hanging Gardens. I already talked about that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. A guy by the name of Diodorus Siculus is another ancient historian who lived from 90 to 30 BC. He writes extensively about the Hanging Gardens in Babylon. Just a few dozen years before the birth of Christ. Babylon, as far as we know, is kind of the seat of modern mathematics, believe it or not. In contrast to the sparsity of sources that record Egyptian mathematics, our knowledge of Babylonian math is derived from over 400 clay tablets that have been discovered since the 1850s. We have extensive knowledge of their mathematical systems and their thinking, their philosophies. Babylonian mathematics were written using a sexagesimal system, meaning it's base 60. We use base 10. You go up to 10 and you start over with 1, in the ones place. And every time you get to 10, you increment the next place, right? Well, they did that with 60. And that's why, to this day, we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. That all comes from Babylonian mathematics. It's likely that the sexagesimal system was chosen because 60 can be evenly divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, and 20. It's a very convenient system of mathematics. And 30. Also, unlike the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans, all the way as late as the Babylonians already had a true place value system, where the digits written in the left column represented larger values, such as we do in the decimal system. The notational system of the Babylonians was the best of any civilization all the way until the Renaissance, 1700s. 1600s. And the power of its mathematics allowed it to achieve these engineering masterpieces. Remarkable computational accuracy and power. For example, the Babylonian tablet number 7289 gives an approximation of the square root of 2 that is accurate to within 5 decimal places. That's amazing. All right, moving on. I can tell you guys are as intrigued as I am. Not the next slide, though. Building science, I'll let you guys read about that. Physical sciences, astronomy, astrology, we're going to deal, we've already seen a lot of that with Daniel and the Magi. It's the Magi that Daniel currently, in our story, is in charge of, that ultimately, 500 years later, show up at the birth of Christ because they have seen his star. Now, what has come down to us in astrology is largely corrupted, okay? And I'm not for a moment recommending that you put any weight in that. However, it has roots in some things that apparently, biblically, showed that it had some real authority to it. And there are some fantastic works that have come about in recent years about the zodiac, what in the Hebrew Bible is called the Mazzaroth. The Hebrew word is the Mazzaroth, which God himself talks about in the book of Job. He points out the Mazzaroth to Job and says, can you cause it to come out in due season? It's by studying the stars, again, what we would call astrology, that the Magi know all of these amazing things about who Jesus is. They know where he's born, roughly. They know that he's the King of the Jews. And I maintain, and they know when he was born, that he was born, and I maintain that they actually knew that he was God and Savior because of the gifts that they bring to him. Okay, but don't get me sidetracked to that. We'll never get done. All right, they're the formation of some of the first political science in the first Babylonian Empire, the Code of Hammurabi, which is what this giant cylinder is. This stands about as tall as a human being, and you can't see it, but this kind of grayish pattern, that's all cuneiform writing in this stone. And it is the code of law under which the first great Babylonian king, a couple hundred years before Nebuchadnezzar, established the greatness of the first Babylonian Empire. And in it, he documents kind of the beginnings of this whole idea of the rule of law. Now, some of what they codified as law we would still think was barbaric, but compared to the rest of the guys at the time, it's amazingly advanced. And some of its principles are codified in the Mosaic law under God. Okay, and only later is it improved upon in the New Testament. But it really is the foundation of even American law, modern law. The Code of Hammurabi is very important in studying the origins of legal systems. Religious-wise, we've talked about this a little bit, but Babylon is really as great as the empire was and all of their science and math and arts and all this kind of stuff, they are also the seat of pretty much every false religion that has ever come upon the planet Earth. Okay, so make no mistake, I'm not a big fan. I'm a fan of the engineering masterpieces, and it's just an amazing study to get into the size and scope of what Babylon was. But it is depicted in Scripture the city of man and the city of false religion. And they were among the first to have this pantheon or a group of gods with all the legends that go along with it and so forth, that go all the way back to Nimrod. And this, if you can see that, I apologize for having this thing in the way, but if you can see this picture here, this depicts Nimrod, who they made into a god. Lots of ancient cultures did that. Buddha became a god. I won't go into all of them, but so did Muhammad, thank you. But they made Nimrod into a god, and Semiramis, supposedly his mother and his wife, and together they have a child named Tammuz who becomes the sun god in ancient Babylon. And I won't go into all of the details, but basically all of our cultural traditions around both Christmas and Easter go right back to here. You ever heard of burning a Yule log at Christmas time? The word Yule, Y-U-L in English, is actually the Chaldean word for infant. Tammuz, the sun god, was thought to be born on New Year's Day, well actually at the day after the winter solstice, which was the shortest day of the year. And then he grows throughout the year, and then he dies at the winter solstice of the following year. In other words, as the days grow shorter, he grows older, and he eventually dies, and is then reborn the following day, and the days begin to get longer again. To celebrate this, or I don't know, to commemorate at least, they would burn, and he's always in the form of a child. Okay, so they would burn a Yule log in the fireplace on midwinter's eve, the eve of the solstice, and then the following day celebrate his rebirth. But Yule is the Chaldean word for infant, so that is Tammuz. So you're celebrating child sacrifice if you burn a Yule log. But the golden Semiramis was the goddess of beauty and fertility, and there's this whole, she gets translated into Ishtar and Astarte, and there's this whole mythology about the golden egg, which is where we get Easter eggs that strangely down through history become associated with rabbits, because rabbits are a symbol of fertility. Somewhere the wires got crossed, but it's all goes back to ancient Babylonian mythology. Anyways, enough about that. I don't want to ruin your Christmas and Easter anymore. And by the way, there's argument about this, and there's some evidence that this is not true, but by and large, I think most commentators believe that the word Easter comes from Ishtar, the Ishtar gate. Ishtar is the Babylonian goddess of fertility. So it's strange coincidence. It is a coincidence because we celebrate Easter because of when Christ was crucified, and we know when that was. We know exactly when that was. But it also happens to be very close to the vernal equinox, which is, equinox, which is the first day of spring, and that celebrates fertility and all of that. All right, where are we at? 18. Not going to get into this, but Babylon becomes tremendously important prophetically in the later writings, and we'll see that again in Daniel. I'm not sure if we'll get into that, but it shows up extensively in Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and then the book of Revelation. Babylon is the name given to the woman who rides the beast being the Antichrist. And then when she falls, and this is extremely symbolic language, and there's a lot of controversy about exactly what it means, but there's some pretty strong evidence toward the world system that's represented there, false religions that have come from Babylon, actually all the way down through the Christian church, through the Middle Ages, into the Roman Catholic Church, and into the Eastern Orthodox Church. And there's a lot of evidence that is being depicted in advance in the book of Revelation as this woman that rides the beast. There's some excellent material out there about this. I'm going to leave that for now. All right, in modern days, Saddam Hussein, there appears to be some evidence. I haven't heard whether it's verified or not, but he believed himself to be an actual descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, or at least from the same tribe, clan, whatever. And he began rebuilding Babylon, much to the dismay of the archaeologists, despite the fact that he enlisted many of the greatest archaeologists available to him in order to excavate and to figure out what it looked like. Nevertheless, he's rebuilding these buildings on top of the ancient ruins. You can imagine how the archaeologists feel about this. But this is actually a map of the modern reconstruction. And here's some pictures. This is a satellite photograph of all the buildings that he's reconstructed. Not sure if the Euphrates is in. The Euphrates has shifted significantly, and it no longer flows through the center of town. This is a coin he had minted for a particular anniversary. I don't remember what it was, but that's his face next to Nebuchadnezzar's. Here's some more of the buildings. Here's some of the lions that I was talking about that line the processional way that he's had reconstructed. Here's some of the walls, much smaller than the original ones were, but nevertheless very impressive. And this is a parade that went down processional way back in the 80s. There was a book called The Rise of Babylon that was written about all of this and possible prophetic implications. This is a mural to this day, still on the side of one of the walls. As you come into town, that's Hussein and Nebuchadnezzar riding on his chariot. I don't know what the other symbols are, but and another one, Saddam Hussein, Nebuchadnezzar, Ishtar Gate. This is the Code of Hammurabi is depicted right above the gate there, and the walls of Babylon and so forth. I think that's it. So that's it. Any questions about this stuff? that's where I want to end. Didn't have as much time left as I'd hoped, but we've got some time for questions. So at this point, I just want to open things up to questions about this, or about Daniel, or about anything else that you may have brought.
What do we know about the other Jews in Babylon? What was happening to them during the time of Daniel? And how were they allowed to live?
That is a great question, and I think the answer is not much. We have a little bit of recordings in their history, I think.
Because it was a large number that
Yeah, thousands and thousands.
Not executed, but allowed to live, I think.
Most of the population was allowed to live. Some of the royalty and the royal court was executed when Nebuchadnezzar, because of the battle, the third siege, lasted for a long time. A lot of people died in the siege as a result of starvation. They had resorted to cannibalism and all these horrible stories. Some of that is recorded in, I want to say, Second Chronicles. Don't hold me to that, but I think that's where it's at. I'm not sure that makes sense. It may be Second Kings. Anyways, the Old Testament records a lot of that history, especially during the sieges and so forth, and then being taken captive in there. So some of it's documented there. We don't have an awful lot of testimony, historical evidence from archaeology, but I'm pretty sure we've unearthed, we've got extensive knowledge about Nebuchadnezzar laying siege to Jerusalem. We've discovered tablets that talk about that, where he boasts about it, and the names that we went through a week or two ago. And then don't hold me to this, because this goes way back. It's been a while since I studied this, but I think either Ezekiel or Jeremiah, but not both, went to Babylon in captivity, and the other one didn't. Again, don't hold me to that. It could be completely wrong, but I think one of them writes about being in captivity there as well. So that's about the extent in terms of the common people that were there. Is that kind of what you're asking?
Right, and my thought is they must have been allowed to continue their worship and tradition, because later, when Jerusalem is rebuilt with Nehemiah, a lot of them were allowed to return.
Yes, right? Yes. Certainly they passed on the traditions. Whether they were allowed to practice them is, we know that they were not allowed to continue the sacrifices. Okay, they may have done something like Passover, but they didn't have the temple. And the temple is the only place authorized by God. And they mourned during that entire 70 years that they didn't have the temple. And when it happened again in whatever it was, 135 AD, it happened in 70, and then again when the Romans actually leveled everything and sowed salt into the land, and they were done completely, what we call the diaspora, when the Jews were scattered to the nations. They actually changed the religion because they knew they were never going to have a temple again. And that's where the Talmud and so forth comes from, is when they kind of reinvented what Judaism is and made the sacrificial system symbolic. Well, they kind of missed the point of why God allowed the temple to be destroyed. But yeah, during that time, the sacrificial system in the priesthood was not functioning. Now, certainly they taught the traditions to their children and so forth. 70 years goes by, so there's at least one full generation. But Daniel survives the entire time. He's still around when Cyrus frees them. Darius. Cyrus conquers Babylon. Darius is the one that frees them. Okay? Good question.
The Tower of Babel, was that shown in some of the...
There was one in the beginning there that I think was trying to depict the tower, but the ziggurat that you see, that's a known, we found that, and they don't think, now it's possible that was built on the foundations of the original one, but there seems to be some evidence that the original tower may have continued to stand, but was not that ziggurat. So most of what you saw in that big temple in the middle of town there, that wasn't it. That was, at the top of that ziggurat was the temple to Marduk, if I'm not mistaken. He's the patron god of the city of Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar's personal god as well. So I think the Babylonian creation myths even include Marduk. He's kind of the top of the pantheon in Babylonian mythology. But I'm not very well versed in Babylonian mythology. So there's maybe 24 gods, I think, that they had, male and female, various. Very similar to the Greeks and the Romans in many respects. But other questions? Everybody brought questions with them, right? Anything goes. So what are you guys thinking about Daniel? How are we doing so far? What have you liked? What have you found tedious? What are you looking forward to? Amber. What? I'll pick on you.
I don't like being put on the spot.
You don't have to answer. It's fine.
Well, I wasn't actually just.
But since you did,
Well, it doesn't have to do with that because I can't. My brain doesn't work that fast.
that's
to
fine.
think
That's
about
fine.
it. Well, I was just thinking of the Tower of Babel, and so God scattered everybody, and so God created all the languages that we have. So was it? I don't know. I'm just interested in that whole thought, what that actually meant. It just kind of skims over it so briefly, this is what happened. I don't know. So what was that like? Obviously you weren't there, but
Which piece?
no, just
You're talking.
But
She's calling me old. Anyway, which part? The changing of the languages, or the scattering, or what they were doing that caused it?
well, I know, obviously the tower and everything, but I don't know. So what did that? There was just one major city where everybody was.
Well, I don't think that was the case, that it was one city. I would say you're probably right in saying one major city. This was the capital of the world at the time, was Babel. And that's where the great minds, the great arts, the great sciences had gathered together, is the idea behind this. And because they were all of one language, there were no barriers. There was it's like a whoopee cushion in the chair. Ostensibly, from what God says about what they were doing, nothing could stop them. In fact, let's just read that. No, it's a great question. And I can tell you kind of where the commentaries go and what we have, a little bit of what I know from archaeology and those sorts of things. And kind of some of the ideas, but recognize that you're exactly right. What the Bible has to say about it is pretty sparse. So anything else is kind of conjectural. There's some things that are reasonably straightforward that we can deduce about it, but it says, it came to pass, starting in verse 1, Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. Yes, the Middle East was rich in asphalt. Read that, oil. Okay, right from the very beginning. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now nothing they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us," who's he talking to? Yeah, not the angels. This is the Trinity. Same language throughout Genesis, right from chapter 1. It says, "Let us make man in our own image." Let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. And then it goes into the genealogy, the descendants. So the idea is, what we have here in chapter 11 is similar. It echoes chapter 6. The days from Adam to the flood show man's digression. Okay? Man's not evolving, he's devolving. He's focusing his God-given talents for intellect, for art, for creativity, toward fleshly, prideful, sinful ends. Okay? That's what man does with his talents when left to himself. Ultimately, it resulted in the state that God describes before the flood. He says, describing mankind, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That is an amazing statement. Okay? Multiple superlatives in that. Everything all the time is evil. And what we see is that immediately after the flood, despite Noah and his sons, as men begin to multiply again after the flood, the same thing begins to happen all over again. Okay? And so this time, rather, because God had promised not to judge the earth again, this time he scatters them. He creates obstacles for them to overcome, primarily with distance and with language. Okay? That's how he breaks them up. And to this day, that has been an obstacle. And it's interesting to see that in the areas where modern technology has excelled, the sciences, for example, engineering and research, whether you're talking cutting-edge physics, astronomy, particle physics, cosmology, these theoretical physics, the only way that they've been able to do that is to adopt one language and force all of the scientists to learn that language so that they could communicate with each other. Usually that's English, but not always. Okay? Heaven knows why. Of all of the languages to pick on the planet, English is among the most difficult. But it also has the advantages of being very technical in nature, like Greek before it, and Latin as well. Greek first and then Latin. They're very technical type of languages. The Romance languages don't lend themselves nearly as well to advanced technological words and discussions and descriptions. So that's kind of the idea. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but...
Yeah, I guess you can't answer my question.
Probably
because
not.
It's the idea of I wonder what, happened.
What it actually
he,
was like.
Scattered them. And
Yeah.
did people just come to and start speaking another language? Were they freaked out?
It's a great question. I think that it's interesting that it does kind of echo Acts chapter 2, where in some sense the reverse happens. It's not really reversed because they're speaking different languages again, but that's considered the birth of the church. Acts chapter 2 is Pentecost. So Jesus, before he ascended, after the resurrection, he told his disciples, I want you guys to stay here. Ultimately, I'm sending you out to the far reaches of the earth. I want you to start in Jerusalem, then to Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth to take the gospel. But, he says, wait in Jerusalem until the Holy Spirit has come upon you. Okay? And I will be with you forever. Matthew 28 and Matthew 28:18 and Acts 1:8 are the Great Commission verses. So they hang around in Jerusalem, and Acts chapter 1 and 2 kind of chronologue that. But they're all gathered together. There's about 200 of these guys, and that's not all of them, by the way. That's the ones that this happened to. But there's about 200 people gathered together in a second floor room, having a meal, ostensibly, and a worship session, it seems. When the Holy Spirit, they hear this great sound like they didn't say like a freight train. They said like a rushing wind, but it's kind of the same idea. That they hear this roar, and then they begin to look around, and they see these little, what they called tongues of fire, little flames appearing over the head. And this is the Holy Spirit manifesting. He's changing his relationship with mankind at that moment. He goes from dwelling upon man, where the Holy Spirit came upon men in the Old Testament, to dwelling within. This is where man goes from worshiping in a temple to becoming the temple of God. Okay, and the Holy Spirit begins to indwell man and empower them, and this is when the spiritual gifts are bestowed with the advent of the Holy Spirit within us. And this is the gospel. This is what makes the church unique in all of history, is the idea that God can actually live within us. It's unique in all of human history. In the past, God had to separate himself from man because of sin. That's what the veil in the temple was all about. But at Pentecost, he says, you are now the temple. 7 times in the New Testament, it says, you are the temple of God. And so the first thing that happens is they begin to speak in other languages. But it's for a purpose this time. In Pentecost, in Acts chapter 2, there were many other strangers in Jerusalem around the periphery watching this happen, apparently, and they could hear them. And it says these people from all known parts of the world, all areas of the empire at the time, that spoke different language. Now, everybody had to speak Greek because you were in the empire, but everybody also had their own language. And what amazed them was they heard these disciples speaking in their own language, praising God. So in this case, God, I don't want to use the word confuses the languages, but he causes people to speak in other languages, but it's for the purpose of bringing glory to himself, rather than stopping the self-glorification of man in Babel. So there's a definite link there. Okay, there's an echo, and I think that's free. We see that all the time. We could spend a whole evening talking about compare, and more to the point, contrasting Jerusalem and Babylon. Okay, and in the same way that the church has its start with this issue of languages, so did false religion have its start with the confusion of languages. So in some ways, we might look to that as some piece of the answer to what you're talking about. But ultimately, what would it have been like to be there? And be a great, and people have tried to make this into a movie and just failed miserably. It's been a long time since somebody tried to depict the confusing of the languages at Babel. But we can let our imaginations run and kind of fill in the blanks. So what would it be like if all of a sudden nobody in this room spoke the same language? What would we do? We'd spend a while trying to get each other to understand, and ultimately we'd get disgusted or tired of trying, and then find other people that did speak the same language. And we'd naturally congregate together with them and say, let's blow this popsicle stand, let's go find our own place, and we'll build our own city. Obviously I'm adding, but that's kind of the idea. You can fill in the rest. That's the extent of it. Any others? Wow, you guys.
Not a question.
Really
just
didn't.
a couple of
Sure, yeah,
observations
please.
so far. Just been struck by some things you've pointed out that just help us see God's plan and design and grace. And first, that Nebuchadnezzar didn't wipe out the people, and why he chose
Shadrach, Meshach, or
No,
the
all of
whole
the
Jews.
Jews,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
You know, but God protects his people. And the fact that he chose any Jews to be trained,
Yeah.
you know, in his court, let alone rise to some of the supreme positions, is amazing. And that their customs, just that they were, even for 70 years, I wonder if all of a sudden I was planted in some other country with customs so different, you know, just how I'd be affected by that, but they held on to it enough, or God, again, protected it enough for them, and that Nebuchadnezzar even fostered, somehow, relationships with different people groups that he had.
You know, just to tag into that, it's interesting. I hadn't thought of it until just now, but that 70-year separation, the people that went free, is roughly like us looking back to World War II. Okay? It's about the same distance in time, and hearing the stories about the horrible things that happened to our parents and grandparents at those times, and trying to relate that and trying to teach that to our children so they don't forget, you know, what the world was like back then. There's some similar, that may be a way for us to kind of relate.
Right, a lot of that is already lost.
Yeah.
You know.
And the
from
people
then
that
to
lived
now.
through that are almost non-existent anymore, that actually fought in those wars. Yeah.
Right, yeah, we just
So
lost a World War II buddy at 96.
Yeah.
So, and he did share his story, which was great. And I think one of the things that most amazes me is that Nebuchadnezzar, for how powerful he was and how powerful God allowed him to be, that by God's grace he was saved. I think that is
Absolutely.
just shows the mercy of God.
Had to be humbled
Mhm.
and brought to his knees before he could be saved. But yeah,
And
yeah,
I-
absolutely.
Really like in Daniel 3, I just recently listened to it because we were gone, but how you talked about groups of people, you know, that are judged, how some are, the three groups of people.
Mhm.
That was very interesting.
Those that go through the judgment,
What-
those that
right.
die in the judgment, those that are
Same
raptured
thing in
out.
the flood, but that was really interesting. I want to listen to that again.
Good,
and
good.
see it in some other parts of the Bible, so enjoyed it.
I recently found another list of those and discovered that there were 2 or 3 more that I had missed. There's probably 7 was on the list. I think I listed 4. I think the list was 7. Now I'm not remembering what they were again, but I said, oh yeah, I forgot about that. So, it's neat to see that as a pattern, as a theme, as something that God repeats and drives the idea home. That all point us to the ultimate judgments and the end times as well. Thank you very much. Anything else? Other?
Now, moment. Maybe tomorrow.
Really appreciate that. All right. Well, we're past our time. Unless anybody else has got something, I'll go ahead and close. Could I ask somebody else to close this? Anybody else?
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, may I just
You volunteering to close this?
No, I'm not. But just for prayer for Kim, she's been sick the last 3 weeks, and that's why she hasn't been here. And she said she started to feel better, but then this morning she woke up and she was feeling not. So just prayer for her.
Yeah. In fact, let me request that everybody, well, anyways, be praying for our group, be praying for people that are traveling here, be praying that God brings together the group that He wants each time we meet. But especially for Kim, but for the rest of us as well. And Sherry's sister, Katie, has also really had some really significant health problems in the last week. And today, when was she diagnosed with shingles? Was that
2 days ago.
2 days ago?
They
So
said
it's
it was poison ivy, and she got worse. And went to ER, and they said you don't have poison ivy, you got shingles. And
Yeah, so
she's
she's
doing a lot.
miserable at the moment.
She already has a lot of other health issues.
Yes,
Now to
she
have that on
does.
top
Yeah,
of it.
it's just insult to injury. So, our enemy absolutely wants to keep us from coming together to study the Word, and he'll use anything that he can. So, I try very hard to continue to pray for the group, and especially on Wednesdays during the day, just that everybody would be freed and not have things like this come up. Join with me in that, and especially for those who are already afflicted within our group. Thank you, Amber. Somebody want to close this?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we've had here to study your word, Daniel. Thank you for the beautiful day that we've had with the sun shining and good weather today. We ask for your healing power for the people that are sick or physically have ailments. And we ask for your protection for those people as they begin to heal up. And also we ask for your protection for all of us who are attending, that we can continue to get in your word, study your word, and have our eyes opened by your word and your Holy Spirit. So we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Kurt. Couple of announcements. One is we need some more sign-ups for snacks. The sheet is over on the table there with the snacks. And also I wanted to remind everybody that I think we've still got 2 more weeks after this one. So next week and the following we'll still be here, but after that we're going to be at the clubhouse, right? Okay. I'll send out directions, but it's just
Down the street,
Sherman, right? Yeah. Not Emerson, Sherman. Yeah, so Sherman runs north and south right here by the, comes right past this addition. If you just take that north to Southport Road, just before you get there, there's a little apartment complex there, and that's the clubhouse that we'll be in. So it's just a bow shot away, and we'll be there for 3 weeks. I'm probably going to change around our schedule. Not a big deal, nothing. But what I may do, just for Amber and John's sake, is make sure that before they leave, we cover chapter 9, because that may be the most important chapter out of the whole book. And I want to make sure that as many people as possible have the opportunity to go through that. So we may pull that one forward just a little bit. It kind of is in a microcosm by itself. It's not dependent on the chapters that come before or after. So it's an easy study to pull out and do independently. I think that's all announcement-wise. Yeah. So thank you for coming.
Food.
Food, yeah. Food, fellowship.